So our next talk is by Michael Wheeler, who's going to talk to us under the title, which is on the screen, Science, Friction, Phenomenology, Naturalism, and Cognitive Science. And as the slide shows, Michael comes from the University of Stirling. He tells me he recently published a book called Reconstructing the Cognitive World, which is a Heideggerian version of cognitive science. Sounds challenging. And indeed, even more bravely, he's recently finished an entry for the Stanford Encyclopedia on Heidegger, which no doubt we will send all our students to, but which will no doubt also fail to satisfy the impossible demands of the world's Heideggerians. So, I hope here we are in a more friendly disposition towards you, Michael.
Well, maybe you start out that way. We'll see how we end up. Okay, so the term friction in the title is doing two jobs. Okay, on the one hand, it's tagging the fact that I think for many people the combination of phenomenology and naturalism invites a certain tension, shall we say, philosophical tension. There's a kind of prima facie, as it were, friction there. But it also is going to play a positive role later on in the talk, in the sense that what I want to argue in the end, I think quite consistent with what Dan Zahavi was saying yesterday, I want to provide a framework in which we can see phenomenology and naturalism, as it were, placing friction on each other in a way that's productive and positive with respect to understanding. There's a kind of negative to positive shift in the notion of friction in this talk. Now, as you may reasonably infer from the introduction, the person I'll be referring to is not Husserl, but Heidegger. A little bit of Merleau-Ponty at the end if I get time, but mostly Heidegger. And I guess the sort of comparison that sets up the initial tension is with a sort of mad scientist, or should we say, more likely, a mad philosopher who loves science in that way. David would be any time. Well, the hair's quite similar. No. So anyway, but the point being here, that look, we as soon as we put Heidegger next to science, then we feel a tension, and the question is, can we relieve that tension? Well, let's see where we go. Okay, so I'm going to start out by being as specific as I can about what I mean by phenomenology, and as vague as possible about what I mean by naturalism. Later on, I'll sharpen up the notion of naturalism.
Main menu.
Sorry, I'm just going to dim the light.
So later on, I'll sharpen up this notion of naturalism as the argument unfolds. So I'm going to take phenomenology, and immediately some people will dislike this, but just read out the definition and I'll come back to it. I'm going to take phenomenology to be a theoretical, or perhaps, in some sense, meta-theoretical, philosophical enterprise that through an attentive and sensitive examination of all
Hang on, I think I can make it better. There.
Won't be able to see who's firing the gun if you do that. So not a theoretical or perhaps meta-theoretical philosophical enterprise that through an attentive and sensitive examination of ordinary human experience aims to reveal the transcendental yet historical conditions which give that experience its form. So first of all, notes on the things in green here. I think that there's a kind of way of thinking about phenomenology where you think of it as a descriptive enterprise, and to the extent that you emphasise that, it often seems as if all you're doing is kind of reporting the surface features of subjective experience. And that's clearly not the notion of phenomenology that's at work in Heidegger. So in the broadest possible sense, I'm going to take phenomenology to be a theoretical enterprise that attempts to mine, as it were, the transcendental conditions of possibility for experience to be the way it is. The historicality in Heidegger's notion of the transcendental comes from the hermeneutic character of understanding in general. The phenomenologist will be bringing certain preconceptions to the task at hand. It's a culturally embedded, historically embedded understanding. And that will play an absolutely critical, and I think possibly under-argued part in the argument a bit later. So I'll hopefully cover that up when we get to it. On the other hand, naturalism, so I'll try to be very specific about what I'm going to mean by phenomenology. But I'm going to start out with the thought that naturalism is just the claim that philosophy should be continuous with empirical science. Okay? And nothing more than that for the moment. Obviously, to have any kind of decent understanding of what naturalism is, we need to fill in the details of what continuity amounts to. And that will come back later. That issue will come back later. Alright, so, uneasy bedfellows. Could one develop a coherent research programme that was committed both to phenomenology as a philosophical methodology and to naturalism? So my strategy here will be to focus on a specific case in which this has been attempted. Okay? The attempt to build a Heideggerian cognitive science. And I'm going to concentrate on some arguments that have been lodged against the very idea that one could build a Heideggerian cognitive science. And these arguments have two different forms. According to one of these arguments, cognitive science, of course, is, as I'll say in a moment, is going to be committed to a certain kind of naturalism, and naturalistic theorising fails to respect the deliverances of phenomenology. That would be one kind of complaint that could be made. A second kind of complaint that could be made is that phenomenology has an unyieldingly anti-naturalistic character. And we've seen versions of both these arguments already in this conference. And I'm going to concentrate on some published versions of these and try and resist them. And in the process, I hope, show how one could have a naturalised phenomenology or perhaps a phenomenological naturalism. Alright, so, test case, a Heideggerian cognitive science. Let's first be very clear. What I mean by a Heideggerian cognitive science will be a cognitive science that systematically integrates Heideggerian phenomenology with the foundational features of cognitive science. So let me just say something about that. Of course, it's possible for people in cognitive science who are interested in explaining conscious experience, for instance, through whatever scientific states and processes, scientifically identified states and processes they work with, it's possible to borrow kind of insights from Heidegger. So famously, for instance, Heidegger's notion of the ready to hand, for instance, has played a big role in some recent cognitive science thinking. But for something that counts as a Heideggerian cognitive science, we have to go further than that. It's not a question of borrowing the odd piece of early stages of the existential analytic, okay, in Being and Time. It'll be a cognitive science that systematically integrates its theoretical postulates, its methodology and so on with a kind of Heideggerian philosophical framework. And part of that will mean ensuring that its methodology is consistent with the foundational features that will be necessary for something to be a cognitive science. Now, I take it that any philosophical framework, particularly a philosophy of mind, cognition, consciousness, that rides shotgun, as I put it, with cognitive science, that's going to align itself with cognitive science, must be naturalistic in form. Okay, I'm going to take that to be an assumption. I guess one could try and think of having a cognitive science that wasn't naturalistic, but I'm going to take that to be a requirement here. So a Heideggerian cognitive science, a cognitive science that was systematically integrated with Heideggerian phenomenology, requires that phenomenology to be compatible with naturalism. Right? Otherwise we don't get off the ground. Okay, so Rob Rupert, in a book called Cognitive Systems and the Extended Mind, rejects the idea that cognitive science is ever under duty to respect the deliverances of phenomenology. Alright, so Rob says, cognitive psychology does not give trumping power to phenomenological reports or take them as revealing, in some unqualified way, the details of the cognitive processes occurring at the time of the report. And further, a large body of empirical results directly calls into question the reliability of subjects' reports on their own cognitive processing. Now, I should note that Rob here is explicitly criticising my attempt to bring phenomenology and cognitive science together. But I think it's immediately obvious to, I suspect, everybody in this room, that the kind of enterprise that Rob Rupert thinks of as phenomenology is not the kind of phenomenology that I am taking to be in play. So, an initial response to Rupert here would be to suggest that his criticisms assume that phenomenological analysis is largely equivalent to introspection. Now, interestingly, there's been some recent work in philosophy of psychology that argues that actually introspection plays a much bigger role in scientific psychology than people have been willing to admit. So there is a kind of way of worrying here about even if phenomenology were introspection, okay, whether Rob's claim would go through. But let's just allow for the moment that the traditional scepticism one sees in cognitive psychology against introspection as revealing the underlying processes going on when we think, let's say that scepticism is grounded. Still, one's going to say, look, the phenomenology as I've characterised it, as a phenomenology that's attempting to mind, to articulate, to clarify, to amplify the conditions of possibility that make it possible for the experience to be the way that it is, that's clearly not equivalent to introspection. Right, it's straightforwardly to introspection. Nevertheless, Rupert's onto something, I think. Okay, because even once one makes that adjustment, some account needs to be given of how phenomenology might reasonably contribute to cognitive science within a recognisably naturalistic framework. And meeting that constraint requires doing justice to a Rupert-like thought, as I put it, about unqualified trumping. Right, so what Rupert suggests here is this idea that cognitive psychology doesn't give trumping power to phenomenology in some unqualified way, taking the details of phenomenology to give a kind of direct mainline to the structures that psychology is interested in. And that's true whether we think of phenomenology as introspection or whether we think of it on the Heideggerian model that I recommend. So Rupert's onto something, and we'll need to resist that thought later. Okay, someone who's in the room, I know he doesn't mind this, says Matthew Ratcliffe, has also argued against the very possibility of a Heideggerian cognitive science. Sorry that some of the text is off the bottom here, but I'll make sure I cover it. So Matthew has argued in a paper I think called There Can Be No Cognitive Science of Dasein, so Dasein being Heidegger's term for the distinctive human mode of existence. Matthew has given what he takes to be an argument against the very idea of a cognitive science. The idea he's pushing here is that if one adopts a Heideggerian framework, then one can't really see any way of integrating that with cognitive science. And here's the way Matthew's argument goes. I'm going to reconstruct Matthew's argument a little bit. I hope I don't do it any violence. He can tell me if I do. But I'm going to put it a slightly different way to him. But I think this is what he says, and there's some quotes in a moment to show this. So Matthew argues that according to any kind of Heideggerian analysis, anything worthy of being a Heideggerian philosophy, we'd end up concluding that cognitive science tacitly presupposes what he calls a sense of belonging to the world. Okay? And this sense of belonging to the world is disclosed through phenomenological analysis. I'll say more about this notion in a moment. And it's an aspect, we might say, of the way in which human existence is essentially in the world. Of course, famously, in Being in Time, Heidegger cashes out this inness not in terms of spatiality, but in terms of dwelling. One has a place in the world. It's a place where one finds familiarity, if you like. So this idea of sense of belonging to the world, I think, is equivalent to this a sense of familiarity with the world that Heidegger takes to be distinctive of the human embeddedness in the world. So the first pass at explicating this kind of belongingness, and this is a first pass in the sense that it's kind of the first thing Heidegger says about it in the first stages of Being in Time, in the existential analytic. Of course, later on in Being in Time, we get much richer structures of this. But when Heidegger first explicates this belongingness, he does it in terms of the way in which, in ordinary contexts of practical activity, we make those contexts of activity make sense to us in terms of structures that, in a sense, we bring to the world. So, the laptop makes sense to me in terms of my activity of text editing. That text editing is part of writing a paper, that's part of delivering something by a deadline, that's part of my project of being an academic, a way in which I make sense of my own existence. So these kind of networks of referential significance that Heidegger does, they're contexts that are defined by our projects and our activities. And so they're kind of, in a sense, the way we make sense of the world is in terms of structures with which we're familiar. That's the thought. I mean, that's the first pass. As I say, there's much more goes on in Being in Time than that. So that's the kind of first pass, but we'll say more about this. Now, famously on Heidegger's analysis, science reveals entities as what he calls present at hand rather than ready-to-hand and unready-to-hand items of practical activity. So, as many of you know, when entities are revealed as present at hand, they're revealed in terms of properties that are kind of contextually independent. So, weight in kilograms, a place in Cartesian coordinate system space, so on and so forth. And Heidegger's thought is that though that kind of objectification, or revealing the world in terms of objects, is distinctive of the mode of sense-making that we might attribute to science. Now, at this point, there's a kind of bifurcation. This speaks to a point that was mentioned earlier. If we think about worlds on this model, and both of these notions of world are in being and time, there's more than one notion of world at work in being and time. If we think of worlds as constituted by these kind of global networks, of local contexts of this kind of ready-to-hand practical activity, then, as Matthew says, the entities of science are presented to us as stripped to varying degrees of the significance that they previously had, as having lost something. So this is the thought. When you reveal an entity as present at hand through science, through mathematisation and so on, bring it under the laws of science, the way in which one experiences or reveals that entity is as having lost the significance of ordinary sense-making, ordinary worldhood. And if that's true, if that's part of the way in which it's revealed as having lost something, that's an essential part of the way it's revealed, then of course that prior world of ordinary activity might be equivalent to a Husserlian life world. I'm no Husserl expert. Then that's presupposed, right? Otherwise we couldn't experience the entities as having lost that significance. So there's a sense in which it's presupposed. So the world with which we're familiar primarily is presupposed by the worlds as revealed by, or entities as revealed by science. And this is, Heidegger talks about the science, or revealing the world as present at hand anyway, as something like revealing, stripping the world of its worldhood. Okay, de-worlding, kind of interesting way. But there's another way of thinking about this. If one thinks of worldhood as the very structure of intelligibility itself, and one thinks of science as a kind of sense-making, a kind of way of finding the world intelligible, then, as Matthew concludes, both present at hand and ready-to-hand entities presuppose a world within which it's possible to encounter entities in these ways. So if one thinks of things that way, then this sense of belonging to the world will be part of the sense-making of science, and so will be presupposed by that activity as well. So however one goes on this, one reaches this kind of conclusion. And as Matthew describes it, it's a roughly transcendental argument against cognitive science, in effect. Either way, our sense of belonging to, our essential familiarity with the world, emerges as a transcendentally presupposed condition of the distinctive mode of sense-making that's characteristic of science in general, and thus of cognitive science in particular, and so cannot be brought within the explanatory reach of that science. Right, so that's the case. Okay, argument 1 on the table. Argument 2 comes from Andrea Rayberg in a paper called Heidegger and Cognitive Science. And in this paper, Andrea argues that for Heidegger, and here I think we're making although one can make a case this Heidegger is in being in time too, we're making a switch towards the Heidegger of the question concerning technology. Andrea argues that for Heidegger, the objectification of entities through mathematisation, technological thinking, and so on, of entities on which modern science depends, Andrea argues, obscure two important features of the way in which entities are intelligible to us. First of all, she talks about what she calls the self-differing nature of entities. Now, this is a piece of, as it were, technical terminology she introduces. But the idea is this: an entity can appear to us, if we adopt a certain attitude towards it, as a present-at-hand object for science and so on, mathematisation and so on. Or through those processes is revealed as a context-independent object in that way. But of course it can be revealed to us in other ways. So, I can certainly study this as a piece of the physical world, I can weigh it, I can measure it, and so on. I can even talk about its subatomic structure and so on. But I can also respond to it in a different way, as indeed a laser pointer or a clicker or whatever. And the thought being that in the very process of finding it intelligible in one way, there's something about the dynamic of the way we find the world intelligible that closes off other ways of understanding it at that moment. But of course, in some sense, the thing is just the collection of those different dimensions in which it may become available to us. And this can be done on a historical time scale as well. So, the way in which we find the world intelligible closes off other ways of finding the world intelligible that certainly could have been available to us if we'd have been born at different time in history and different cultures and so on. So, objectification, which treats an entity as it were, an object in the way that science might investigate it, closes off, Heidegger thinks, according to Rayberg, not only this essential nature of entities as self-differing, as having these multiple faces, as it were, but also this essential revealing, concealing dynamic of sense-making. And what Andrew argues, suggests Heidegger argues, is that it's through this doubly obscuring character that scientific thinking comes to present itself, or comes to be presented as it were, the one measure of things, the one dominant account of the way things are. A kind of totalisation process. Right, now that's a kind of way that Andrew thinks Heidegger thinks about science. And of course cognitive science will be an example. And here's the way she works. Okay, so first of all she draws a conclusion about science on the basis of this. The more vigorously a science pursues its object, the more does the being, which it thus attempts to capture as object, withdraw itself. Right, so the self-differing nature of entities disappears from view. And then she just applies that to cognitive science with the extra twist, of course, that the target of a Heideggerian cognitive science would be Dasein in terms of being in the world and so on. So the more comprehensively cognitive science tries to secure human existence, Dasein as its object, the more surely will Dasein escape objectification. But if cognitive science were capable of giving up its essence, it would be able to approach Dasein without reducing it to the status of an object. But then it would not be a science, and it would not focus on human cognition, but perhaps on its ways of being. Just to note here, there's this extra twist at the end of Andrea's argument that a Heideggerian cognitive science that gave up its essence as science and then was able to approach Dasein in a fruitful way in terms of understanding, wouldn't just lose its status as a science, but it wouldn't be focusing on cognition anymore, but on ways of being. Now, my own view is that argument that bit on its own doesn't do much work. Because a Heideggerian cognitive science already agrees that we shouldn't be focused on some narrow definition of cognition. A Heideggerian cognitive science already agrees that we need to understand human existence through this kind of structures of being in the world and so on that Heidegger introduces. So the only way that becomes a problem is if it's not possible for a cognitive science to focus on those kind of structures. And of course that will be true if the objectifying process of science closed off those structures. So I think in the end that extra twist in the argument doesn't add any pressure. It's all about the objectification. Alright. 3 arguments. Rupert, Ratcliffe and Rayberg. Must be something about ours. I'm going to give you a recipe now for having your cake and eating it. Right? I.e., I want to suggest that once we understand the relationship between phenomenology and cognitive science properly, and once we get clear about the essential commitments of naturalism, the tension between Heideggerianism and cognitive science, and thus between phenomenology and naturalism, evaporates. And I think it does so in a way that absorbs everything that's right in the arguments of Rupert, Ratcliffe and Rayberg. And just to be absolutely clear, one response you might have to what I'm about to do is that I mangle the notion of the transcendental and I mangle the notion of the natural so hard that they fit together. Right? So that's a suspicion that you might have. I'll just open that up. Right? We'll see what happens. So I'm going to start by introducing what I call a McDowellian lens in which to view things. I'm not going to argue for this, I'm just going to assume this is a way we might approach things. In a paper called The Content of Perceptual Experience, McDowell introduces a distinction between what he calls constitutive, he says explanation, but I want to avoid that word for not very interesting reasons, constitutive understanding and enabling understanding, as I'll put it. So, constitutive understanding, as McDowell introduces it, identifies, articulates and clarifies the conditions that determine what it is for a phenomenon to be the phenomenon that it is. Whereas an enabling understanding, as McDowell understands it, reveals the causal elements along with the organisation of and the systematic causal interactions between those elements that together make it intelligible to us how a phenomenon of a certain kind could be realised or generated in a world like ours. And there I'm taking world to label something like a purely physical universe or something like that. So I'm confessing that. I should have put that. Alright, so there's an assumption there obviously that one might disagree with. So, constitutive understanding, one might think of it as the characteristic target of philosophy, including Heideggerian phenomenology. Although, of course, not only of philosophy, right? There might be many disciplines that can contribute to constitutive understanding, but it seems to have a close link to philosophy. An enabling understanding is the characteristic target of empirical science, including cognitive science. Although not only of empirical science, right? I mean, as a philosopher of cognitive science, when I've got my other hat on, I'm constantly arguing with people about the causal processes that underlie the phenomena of cognition. So, and I do it in a philosophical way. So one doesn't want to get over obsessed with forcing philosophy and science into different categories essentially here. But there's certainly two different kinds of understanding at which these disciplines characteristically contribute. And in any case, I think Heideggerian phenomenology looks like it fits into the particular slot. So, how are these two kinds of understanding related according to McDowell? There's no demand, of course, that constitutive understanding needs to be reducible to enabling understanding. One would need to argue for that, and it would lead to a kind of rampant scientism in a way. So let's just ignore that position for the moment, although I'll mention it again. What McDowell suggests is that our two kinds of understanding will engage in what he calls a perfectly intelligible interplay. Now, he doesn't say much about this, disappointingly little, in fact, about what this intelligible interplay amounts to. And what I'm going to suggest in the next few minutes is that not only did Heidegger already have this interplay in view, he actually gives us an account of it. This will be controversial with Heideggerians, no doubt. But anyway, we'll come to that in a moment. So, here's one direction of influence here. Phenomenology can isolate phenomena for cognitive science to attempt to explain. And for instance, Sean Gallagher and Dan Sahavi in the Phenomenological Mind talk about perspectival incompleteness. So this idea that when I look at an object, although I experience it as having various properties on its backside and its underneath, I can't actually see those in terms of, it depends how you use the word see, of course, but I don't actually experience those directly in some way. That was mangled the way I put that, but you get the point. Nevertheless, we do experience the object as having those properties. Right? And that's a kind of phenomenological deliverance that one might think constrains one's psychology of vision. One's psychology of visual experience needs to explain how that's possible. Okay, so that's one way in which the influence goes, and an example of it. Another way the influence goes, however, and this is the one that some phenomenologists might find controversial, is that the causal profiles discovered by cognitive science may sometimes lead us to revise our conception of what the phenomena under investigation are. There are so many examples of this. Okay, so McDowell's own example is a made-up one. It's kind of nice. He thinks about a frog and imagines that we start out with a theory of, a pre-scientific set of observations about the frog's behaviour, which attribute quite a rich kind of perceptual contact with its world to the frog. And then the scientists come in and they open the frog's head, and what we find inside is just a homogeneous lump of jelly. Right? Now, McDowell's thought is that faced with that datum, that what's inside the frog's head is not complex, it's not sophisticated, we would withdraw our attribution of complex perceptual content to the frog. And so that's his idea of a way in which we might do a bit of science that would affect our constitutive understanding. More specifically in phenomenology, and this is a refreshingly real-world example that doesn't involve slashing up frogs, recent research on mirror neurons, for instance, I'm not going to go into details, don't have time, but as some of you will know, recent research on mirror neurons, I think has changed our phenomenological account of intersubjectivity. And here we can see the work of Sinigaglia and others, Ratcliffe and others. And also, Dan Zahavi gave this example yesterday, Sean Gallagher's work on front-loaded phenomenology, I won't say that again because Dan already described it, would be another example of that. Now, immediately the Rupert argument is off the table, right? Because if you adopt this picture of the relationship between phenomenology and science, then there is no unqualified trumping, right, of the science by the phenomenology. Okay, it's supposed to be an interplay. And we've got examples of how the influence from cognitive science to phenomenology might go. Right, so Rupert's argument is already off the table. We've got rid of this thought that the only way to bring phenomenology into cognitive science would be to adopt some unqualified trumping view where the phenomenologist gets to call the shots and the cognitive scientist runs around trying to work out the wiring. Alright, so that's the end of the unqualified trumping view. We don't need to adopt it. Rupert's argument's off the table. Okay, now let's push on. Now, as I said, I think Heidegger already has the McDowellian intelligible interplay view in his philosophy. I can't really do justice to the interpretative work I would have to do here, but I think it's the only way to make sense of two passages that appear quite close to each other in being and time. So Heidegger says the ontological foundations of, for him it's anthropology, psychology and biology, we might just say cognitive science, can never be disclosed by subsequent hypotheses derived from empirical material. They're always there already, even when that empirical material simply gets collected. This is the, if you like, the phenomenology to science kind of direction of travel. Cognitive science assumes certain ontological foundations. These will be the conditions that determine the constitutive character of its target phenomena. So for instance, one might adopt a view of mind which sees it as an essentially representational system. There will then be arguments about what the concept of representation means, and these will be part of the constitutive foundations of the science, the basic concepts of the science, as sometimes gets said. Okay, so that's now, some of you will immediately go, but that's surely not all there is to ontological foundations. You're right, I'll come back to that in a moment. But let's just work with this for a moment. So Heidegger argues that these ontological foundations cannot simply amount to further empirical hypotheses. These can't be disclosed by subsequent hypotheses derived from empirical material. It doesn't follow from that, however, that those foundations are wholly independent of the ongoing empirical research. It just doesn't follow. It just says that the empirical science on its own can't deliver a fully articulated, clarified account of its own ontological foundations, using its own distinctively scientific methodology. There's going to have to be some philosophy in there, right? That's the thought, roughly. Here's a second quote from Heidegger. The positive sciences neither can nor should wait for the ontological labours of philosophy to be done. The further course of research will not take the form of an advance, but will be accomplished by recapitulating what has already been ontically, i.e. scientifically discovered, in this context scientifically discovered, and by purifying it in a way which is ontologically more transparent. So what's going on in this quotation? Seems to me, as long as one understands the further course of research here, which I think one has to, although one could have an argument about this, as tagging the further work of phenomenological philosophy, right, then what Heidegger is saying here is that science can go on in its work, and in doing so, of course, it will be making certain assumptions about its own ontological foundations. But then philosophy can come in, of course, and help to clarify, articulate, amplify those foundations and contribute in that way. But note that this accomplishment is a matter of recapitulating what has already been ontically discovered. Recapitulating what has already been ontically discovered in this translation. The thought being, I think, that the only way to make sense of this, I think, and Heidegger doesn't quite say this, but it's the only way I can make sense of this, which suggests that through the empirical research, of course, at certain points, will rewrite its own ontological foundations. This will be a Kuhnian paradigm shift, or a rewriting of Lakatosian core assumptions in science. The hardcore, as Lakatos calls it. So there are points where science does rewrite, through its own, as it were, process of development, does rewrite its own ontological foundations. So, in a sense, science doesn't need philosophy, doesn't need to wait for the ontological labours of philosophy to be done. Good job, too, about the time it takes us. Right, but anyway, so there's no way of making sense of this picture without seeing the ontological foundations as being sensitive to, indeed, radically rewritable in terms of ongoing empirical research, or in the wake of, rather, ongoing empirical research. So, we now have something like the structured McDowellian interplay in place in Heidegger's work, of course with a phenomenological slant on the constitutive. This is why I've called it neo-McDowellian. I don't like having neo before words, but anyway, that's what it is. Alright, quick objection and a reply. How am I doing? What about 10 minutes or something? Okay, quick objection and a reply. You might think that the kind of ontological foundations I've been talking about, such as the concept of representation, or I don't know, the concept of a gene, or something like that in biology, that these concepts are not, as it were, deep enough in some sense. That regional ontology, to use the Husserlian term, depends on fundamental ontology, i.e. the ontology of the very structures of sense-making of Dasein. And there's evidence, of course, of this dependence, as Heidegger puts it. The question of being, of how anything is intelligible, aims at ascertaining the a priori conditions not only for the possibility of the sciences, which examine beings as beings of such and such a type, and in doing so already operate with an understanding of being, but also for the possibility of those ontologies themselves which are prior to the ontological sciences and which provide their foundations. Right, so now you might think, well, now we're in a different realm. We're not talking about representations and genes anymore. We're talking in terms of the temporal structures of existence that Heidegger identifies in Division 2. Well, you've got to be careful, and this is where I'm going to say something radical about the notion of the transcendental, but I'm heartened by the fact that this notion of the transcendental has already been scouted in a couple of previous talks. Dan yesterday said at one point, well, look, at the end, Husserl thinks the transcendental has to be part of temporality, has to be within temporality. Here I would say in terms of has to be within history. Right, that would be Heidegger's historicisation of the transcendental. Once you do that, okay, then I think you lose the thought that fundamental ontology, even, can really be independent of things we might discover through empirical science. So this is the sort of radical claim that some Heideggerians won't like. Heidegger said, well, he doesn't quite say this, but in a kind of famous Heideggerian tagline, being is always the being of some entity. It's very difficult to work out exactly what that means, but there's no way of making sense of it, I think, while insulating fundamental ontology from empirical impact. After all, if the transcendental, if the final resting place of fundamental ontology is part of history, is part of the development of humankind, and science is part of the activities that human beings perform, then those activities will have some effect on that. So it seems to me one can't historicise the transcendental and then say that science is outside of history and so it doesn't affect it. Right? So we just lose that kind of neat way of insulating phenomenology from science. Okay, so now I'm just going to. I was hoping at the end to give you a bit of an example of a Heideggerian cognitive science that used this intelligent interface stuff. I'm not going to get to that, so I'm going to show rather for the last few minutes exactly how to resist the arguments of Ratcliffe and Rayburn through this. Yeah, no, we won't have time for that. Right, so here we go. So how is the notion of continuity that's the heart of naturalism to be understood? Let's return to that issue first of all. Now we might read continuity with science as meaning reduction to science, but that, as we've said, is not mandatory. So I'm going to read it in a way that I did in the 2005 book as meaning nothing more than consistency with science. I'm going to call this minimal naturalism. So minimal naturalism requires that if and when there's a genuine clash between philosophy and empirical science, so between phenomenology and cognitive science, then it's philosophy that must ultimately give way. Right? I think the consistency requirement forces that. This is a very similar formulation of naturalism to the one that Hugh Price gives in Naturalism Without Representationalism. Now, let's not run away with ourselves here. There's even the most enthusiastic naturalist isn't going to demand that good philosophy give way to bad science, right? So just because we're faced with some piece of madness like Sheldrake's hypothesis doesn't mean we should, because they count as science under some strange description of science, we should just all give in to it, right? Okay? There's no demand of that kind. What this says is that where you've got some apparently well-supported science, philosophy, and you might have a philosophical theory that some way is inconsistent with that, for whatever reason. It might require certain kinds of action or causation that the theory doesn't allow, or have concepts that the theory doesn't recognise. At that point, philosophy is on the back foot. But there's always going to be room for negotiation, right, in this story. But that's the kind of basic requirement. So this secures, but doesn't need anything more radical than, the kind of enabling to constitutive influence that is at work in this kind of Heideggerian version of the McDowellian interplay that I introduced earlier. So I'm going to take that to be a minimal requirement of naturalism. Just that it's consistency with science that's driving the notion of continuity, and that it has this impact. Minimal naturalism doesn't entail cognitive scientism, right, of course. There's no requirement here that science is a measure of all things. With continuity understood in terms of consistency, the fact that there are principled limits on what cognitive science might explain is no longer a threat to naturalism. That's not a worry at all. And of course, on the interpretation that I've been driving of phenomenology, that I've attributed to Heidegger, even the transcendental conditions presupposed by any particular science are not immune to revision in the light of scientific research. So again, there's a balancing act here, there's a dialogue, there's negotiation. And I think this condition, second condition, is an underappreciated consequence, as I've said, of Heidegger's domesticated and historicised notion of transcendental. Okay, so on this model, I just can't see, we're now in a situation where at least the general argument that Matthew tries to drive on the back of a kind of transcendental shortfall. Just given the adjustments to naturalism and transcendentalism that I've made, and given the McDowellian story, I just think we're no longer in a situation where that argument bites. Okay, and with as far as Andrew Rayberg's story is concerned, well, you know, on the model I've recommended, science does have the objectifying effect. The practice of science does have the objectifying effect that Andrea attributes to it, or on Heideggerian grounds attributes to it. And that objectifying way of thinking about human psychology, right, in order to give scientific explanations of it, does inform phenomenological analysis in the fashion required by minimal naturalism. All right? But that doesn't have any consequence of the kind that Andrea's worried about. Right? It would if that objectifying scientific explanation were taken to be a constitutive explanation of human being. But no one's saying that, because we have the distinction between constitutive and enabling explanation in place. So we can have effects from science to phenomenology without seeing the science as making constitutive level claims, right, directly, at least directly, and in that case the kind of objectified work that approach to human beings that drives the science doesn't have the effect of turning human beings into objects as such at the constitutive level of understanding. Right? So, because we're engaged in an enabling explanation, not a constitutive level explanation, paradigmatically when we're doing science. So one has to be careful if those causal explanations of human activity, enabling explanations of human activity given by science, are taken to be constitutive explanations of human being, then one would have a worry. But that's not required by the picture, the Heideggerian picture that I've recommended. One which I think is entirely consistent with naturalism properly understood. So this informing is possible without cognitive science surrendering any of its modern science credentials. Okay? So I think Andrea's argument too. Right. I think I better stop there. I won't give the example. It'll take another 10 minutes and somebody's going to want to share it. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thanks. Now, let's go. Yeah, that's it. Right. Okay. Well, Matthew, I think you get first bite.
Thanks, Mike. I agree with most of what you said, and I kind of like the mangling as well. Dialogue. The slippery move, though, I thought I'd like to hear a bit more about, is this move from negotiating what Heidegger calls basic concepts to negotiating our understanding of being. Now, I think he'd agree with you about basic concepts. And he says a bit later that, I think to quote, the sciences are dogmatic to an almost unbelievable degree. The point being that they are dogmatic, but they're necessarily dogmatic. Yeah. And engagement with basic concepts can and should be part of scientific inquiry. Indeed, he sees it as the most important part. So, all well and good there. But he'd say, regardless of whatever shifts in basic concepts might take place, regardless of what sort of conceptual filter you sort of have in the background of your scientific practices, there's a common, if you like, way of revealing entities. So science, regardless of these changes, invariably relies upon encountering beings as present at hand, objective, use whatever term you like. And then the next move would be the possibility of that kind of intentionality, revealing beings in that way. Presupposes our understanding of being, which is essential to Dasein. Yeah. And furthermore, that way of revealing beings is constitutionally incapable of getting at the understanding of being that it presupposes. So that I'm sure he makes that move. I mean, right. They're all over being in time.
Let me say two things. Oh, sorry, go on.
So I mean, what you can do is say, well, let's loosen up the present at hand attitude of science, but then it becomes difficult to distinguish a typically scientific attitude from other forms of attitude. I'm not endorsing the position, but I think that's the move that Heidegger would make. Right,
so let me say two things. First of all, I was careful not to claim that the susceptibility of fundamental ontology to certain kinds of moves that science might make. I was careful to claim that that was a consequence, I think, of the historicised notion of the transcendental that Heidegger gives us. I didn't say it was what Heidegger says. Okay, so I need to be a bit careful. I'm clearly making a move here that goes beyond a report of what Heidegger himself says. Now, it wouldn't be the first time in the pages of Being and Time that there were things going on that Heidegger himself doesn't recognise, or indeed that contradicts other things that he says. So I think that's okay. I'm making a claim here which suggests that once you historicise the notion of transcendental, and you see science indeed as part of our historical way of making sense of the world in a concrete way, then I don't see any way of insulating it. As long as you don't think that what's happening here is fundamental the sort of concepts of fundamental ontology are being reduced to the effects, the concepts that science are working with. Of course, there's no claim that's the second move. There's a kind of influence on those things. So for instance, it depends how you think about this, right? So at the end of Being and Time, we get the notion of originary, or whichever translation you've got, temporality. Of course, Heidegger never thought that was a stopping point, right? He thought that was as far as he got in Being and Time. That's the most fundamental horizon we get in Being and Time. But there could have been Division 3 and Division 4, and we never got them. And there's questions about whether the later philosophy are those missing divisions. But it seems to me that you've got to be careful. These are revisable notions, right? Now, I mean, of course, science can't show that there is no sense-making going on. But it may be that, for instance, give an example quickly. For instance, if you completely away from Heidegger, just an example of how this might work, sort of relevant to Jimmy Lemon's talk yesterday. It seems to be completely possible, say, for evolutionary psychology, to inform the way we think about our moral decision-making, without suggesting. So, for instance, it might say, what kind of properties can human beings really be sensitive to in the world? And then we might do some psychology of that, without therefore thinking that what's right and wrong gets determined in terms of fitness values, right? So that, you've got to think of these things in a more subtle way. So the thought is that there could be influences on the way in which our basic sense-making structures, the conditions of possibility of experience, that come from what science tells us about ourselves as concrete, historicised individuals, without therefore losing the thought that fundamental ontology is primarily something that's the business of constitutive level understanding, and that's primarily the business of philosophy. So, I mean, I want to say that it's not quite what Heidegger says, but it's implied by it. And secondly, I want to resist a kind of worrying consequence that one might see of that. So it's a sort of delicate balancing act.
Okay, I see where you're going.
Okay.
So I was wondering if minimal naturalism in your sense captures what naturalists care about. So, for instance, it seems to be compatible with that kind of theory of philosophy that postulates a plethora of alien entities that are causally isolated to the rest of the world. You see where I'm going? So that counts as minimally naturalistic, but doesn't be naturalistic in another
Yeah, no, you're right. No, the placeholder for minimal naturalism would allow, if science starts to talk, a science that we think of as well supported, starts to talk about all wacky things that we don't recognise right now, then there would be a case for perhaps philosophy that previously was rejected to come back or something. I don't know. But note that given our contemporary understanding of science, in terms of the kind of physical processes that science talks about, the closure assumption that David spoke about, and so on, if that's what contemporary science is saying, then that will be driving the kind of consistency conditions when we actually cash them out. But you're absolutely right. I think that question is an excellent question in a way, because it opens up the following problem in Heideggerian scholarship, which is that sometimes I think Heidegger wants to be a kind of straightforward scientific realist. When he talks about he says at one point I think it's in the Basic Phenomenology, where he says, nature takes its revenge on a wrong-headed approach, right? The thought is, you can sort of hand responsibility to the way things are over to nature when you adopt a certain attitude for science. And sometimes he really does sound like he wants to be a kind of straightforward scientific realist. And at other times, that's clearly inconsistent with things he says about the historicised status of science. So there's a problem there. I think minimal naturalism, when I characterise it, would be consistent with either story. But the thought would be that it's what's in the science that's driving the specific consistency conditions.
Asking this question, and it's following on from Matthew's response to you, and I do have a sense, so I apologise to all of you, this might be turning into a Heidegger conference. I want to avoid that because I think it's the subject at hand that's the most important thing. I think what I think is really important is this thinking of a kind of transcendental empiricism, which is an interplay. I think that's a much better way of understanding transcendental ways of thinking. I think that's a kind of common theme through the conference, if one wants any commitment to any transcendental way of thinking, and some might not. But a kind of Heideggerian issue, I suppose, is, and you can just say, well, in some sense, what's important to me is what we're thinking about, not whether I'm correct about Heidegger or not. So I excuse myself in advance. The bit where I kind of think I don't follow the step in your argument completely is where you move from the Heideggerian idea that we can't access being except through beings, and then the next point in your slide is empirical, that this is something to do with the empirical.
Right.
And I think there's a jump there.
Yeah, there is.
And I think there's, so I don't, I'm not saying that maybe that is the way you can do it, but I certainly don't think Heidegger does it that way.
Well,
and I just think, I think, if I was going to be a nitpicking Heideggerian, which I'm well capable of being, is that the idea that we can only access being through beings is not fundamental ontology. And in fact, I think he uses a different word to describe it in the lectures. And I can't remember what, meontology or something.
Yeah.
He uses a different word. And I mean, it might not be a problem, because one of your ways of answering it is, well, maybe, and I think Heidegger does, maybe we should give up fundamental ontology. And really, but even if we give up fundamental ontology, which I'm quite happy to, I still think, as I said, that's my question is, there's some steps in your thought from that distinction between being and being to the empirical, which I wasn't quite sure
No,
about.
good. No, well, that's. I mean, I said at one point there's a big step that is under argued for. Is that move? But I mean, in a way, if I'd had the chance to sort of restructure some of this, I wouldn't have used that being is always the being of some entity idea without marrying it to the more directly to the historicised notion of the transcendental. I think that's when you put those together that you get the implication. I mean, of course, I've got two. I mean, there's an easy move. Well, it's not that easy, of course. There's one move I could make, which is just to say, well, look, I think this is an implication of what Heidegger's saying. He himself doesn't say that, and he has good reasons, independent of these kind of considerations, for not saying that, for other things he wants to defend and other things he takes to be important. I mean, Andrea Rayberg, in her paper, for instance, points to the fact that, possibly one move would be that the only way he sees it possible to maintain a kind of decent sense of freedom is to somehow free Dasein up from these kinds of explanatory measures, perhaps to an extent that even minimal naturalism would be too much for. So don't get me wrong, I think there'll be good reasons for resistance. I'm sure the Heideggerian orthodoxy would agree to resist it. I still think that once you see science as part of our historical sense-making practices, then it's hard to see, and you think that this transcendental becomes historicised, such that these different assumptions can be put in place at different times and so on. I just don't see how to keep them apart anymore, to keep science apart. And so from that point of view, I just want to sort of dig in and say I just don't see how to keep them apart. But I do agree there's much more needs to be said there. And I also don't want, I don't want to claim that it's uncontroversially Heidegger's view.
Yeah, I'll be very, very brief because I don't want to dominate. I just think that it doesn't necessarily have to be empirical. It can be empirical.
Yeah, okay.
One, but it doesn't have to be.
No, absolutely, no, don't get me wrong. I mean, one of the things that I think I possibly didn't say this loudly enough or with enough conviction, but I also think that progress in understanding the fundamental concepts, the regional ontological concepts of science, let alone what you might somehow hive off as fundamental ontology, that I think progress in that can be made by straightforward philosophical argument and critique and so on. I don't think science is the only. It's not, I mean, there's a Kuhnian or Lakatosian, depending on how realist you want to go, understanding of science, in which science drives itself into these dead ends and then rewrites its own. Or at least as a kind of, in some of the early Kuhs have, it's a kind of religious conversion to a new science kind of idea. But I think some of that can be driven by philosophical reflection, not just by the science. I just want to get both processes in the picture.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I think Heidegger would have hated cognitive science, actually.
I don't think so.
I don't think he would have given any place for the kind of friction you talked about. I mean, as you talk about this, his later philosophy of technology and what he says about medicine in the Solikona seminar. But what I want to say is that I doesn't think that matters. I mean, what you should do in phenomenology is you should try to advance it, and of course you should try to advance it behind Heidegger, and you can do it on his grounds and call it Heideggerian phenomenology. That's fine. So I don't bother so much about this short quotes from Simon Sack where he tried to make room for this in Heidegger. That's not the kind of important question. But given that there can be such a feedback from cognitive science and other types of sciences to phenomenology through mirror neurons or other findings, which at least I am very sympathetic to this dialogic view. What would you say about the other way around with a specific example of cognitive science? I mean, what does Heideggerian cognitive science in your version mean? Would you sit there with the cognitive scientist? Would it be a part of it? Or would it rather be a kind of dialogue partner or something like that? Very much about what you said here about cognitive science, identified it with science, like the third person perspective. And then, per definition, there would be no place for the kind of Heideggerian phenomenology.
Ooh, that I'm not so yeah.
Okay,
That I'm
maybe
not
you could
sure
expand
about.
a little
Yeah.
bit.
Okay, so a very quick note on the first thing. I mean, I am interested in contributing to Heidegger scholarship as well. But I agree with you. There's a sense in which one might say, well, it isn't. I mean, the kind of you can pick on sort of Heideggerian model, value in that, and then the thought was, well, you know, we can show in general terms how phenomenology and cognitive science can fit together. Maybe at that point you give up a lot of the Heideggerian stuff if you don't want it anymore. But I'm interested in both sides of that story. So, but I'm particularly interested in cognitive science. Okay, I mean that's my background fundamentally. My first philosophical work was in that area without the Heideggerian stuff. The way I see Heideggerian cognitive science. I mean, I did say something about this, although I didn't give any concrete examples. I wish I'd had time to do so. I mean, I think it's a sense it's a partnership, right? Because in the same way that standard philosophy is part of cognitive science. I mean, it's quite interesting, you know. Cognitive science is an interdisciplinary matrix, and the disciplines that are part of cognitive science has changed over the years. When I grew up in cognitive science, in a cognitive science department, no one mentioned neuroscience. Dirty word, right? Because it was a kind of functionalist thinking that thought that you had to do cognitive science at a kind of computational level that was free of neuroscience. Neuroscience was kind of implementation, messing about, like the electronics in a computer. What we care about, the algorithms. Now, that's no longer true in cognitive science. Neuroscience is now possibly the central discipline in contemporary cognitive science. And that's the way cognitive science itself has changed. Maybe artificial intelligence is no longer as central as it was. That's something about the shifting matrix of cognitive science. So cognitive science has always been a multidisciplinary kind of endeavour. In that sense, it's not quite like, perhaps, physics. And philosophy has always been part of that. And I guess whatever contribution philosophy has traditionally made in cognitive science, I think can be made by a kind of phenomenology. Or it's a kind, you know, to another way in which that contribute. So I see it as part of the process of cognitive science. But what's important, I think, is that if one, you know, when we're talking to philosophers, or if I go and talk to cognitive scientists about it, they don't give a monkeys about the kind of clashes with naturalism, and so they just want to get some good ideas on how to do some more decent experiments or build some neat robots. And the kind of Heideggerian thinking has had a big effect, actually, on the way people have been building smart robots in the last period. Right? Worked by, you know, even though Rod Brooks doesn't admit it himself, you know, he grew up next to Dreyfus in a sense, you know, in a lot of the thinking. So, I mean, it's different. Again, when I'm talking to a philosophy audience, what I'm doing is trying to show that there isn't a philosophical problem about bringing Heideggerian ideas into contact with cognitive science. But then there's a whole other world that opens up. Okay, so they're consistent with cognitive science. So do they make any useful contribution? Right? And then it's about the empirical work. As I say, I would have given an example of empirical work that's going on in cognitive science that I think has been part of a dialogue where phenomenology, and particularly Heideggerian phenomenology, is playing a role in helping science go forward. So I do see it in that way. Yeah.
Okay, last question, Javi.
Thanks, Michael. It was really interesting. It's a shame the way you didn't talk about the case study in more detail, because I think it's one of the most successful examples I can think of where phenomenology interacted with a branch of science in a way that seemed to help solve problems that seemed intractable, right? So things like representationism, the idea that condition has to be centralized, and so on and so forth. All of these things were really resolved, I think, or at least made huge progress once you introduce alternative conceptions.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been saying the word science for a few days now, and it's just kind of getting a bit uncomfortable about not distinguishing between areas of science where the theological viewpoint or viewpoints makes an obvious contribution. For example, might be some of the social sciences, anthropology, sociology, qualitative research in its various forms, and healthcare and so on, and areas like physics where you might say, well, it's less clear what's going on. So do you want to maybe say something about science?
I agree with the point you make. I mean, maybe, I've said here that cognitive science does adopt this kind of objectifying way of being that Heidegger attributes to, at some points, to modern science. But maybe the right thing to say is that there may well be disciplines in and around cognitive science, perhaps some things to do with kind of psychiatry work that Matthew talked about, and things like that, psychiatric work that really doesn't adopt that kind of objectifying way of being, and we still might want to count as science in various ways. So it might be that there are some sciences that don't quite fall under that now, and I should have been more careful about that. However, I do think, for instance, that if you think about cognitive science, at least in its most in the form in which I, as it were, grew up with it. So, we're going to use either computational explanation or perhaps dynamical systems explanations of the human mind. I think those do fit the kind of third-person model that I've been suggesting. Now, of course, there's a whole stream of thought that comes out of Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson and others, where there's something wrong about that. The whole point was that kind of science forgets the first-person perspective, and that we need to get that first-person perspective somehow into the scientific methodology. Right, so that's another move one might make. Now, I'm suspicious about that because I'm actually suspicious about the first-person perspective. And I guess on general kind of Heideggerian grounds, I don't actually recognise the first-person perspective as particularly a deep perspective. It's a kind of secondary perspective, unlike the kind of Husserlian sort of position that Dirk was talking about. So, so I'm a bit nervous about that move. I don't want to make that move. But there's a whole other way of doing this, which would say that what we need to do is rethink what we mean by cognitive science, so as to take account of subjectivity and so on in a way that we haven't done before. I'm kind of being a bit more old school about it here and suggesting that even subjectivity might, or what we think of as subjective phenomena, can be, at least in principle in cognitive science, one cognitive scientist might think could be explained by kind of appeals to computational processing or dynamical systems explanations or whatever. So it's a bit old school, I agree. But you're right, of course, to point out that I've been far too crude with my understanding of science.
No, not just you.
That I was.
Okay, I think we should stop now. I know there were one or two other people who wanted to raise questions, but let's show our appreciation of Michael's talk.